Welcome back to 345. I hope everyone's having a great day. Today is lecture 5, and we're going to be going over client pre-screening, and we're going to talk about needs analysis for when we're working with athletes. I also hope you enjoyed the lab we had last week. I know it wasn't ideal. I much would have rather been in the gym with all of you, going through warm-ups and mobility exercises. If you have any questions about the lab, please do not hesitate to send me an email. In addition, if we need to, we can also set up a meeting over Zoom to go over any of the relevant content. To give you a quick overview of the next couple weeks, including today's lecture of client pre-screening and needs analysis, we'll also be going over the functional movement screen. In addition, we'll also be going over fitness and sports test, talking about sport-specific testing, and discussing normative data. The labs for the next 2 weeks will be the functional movement screen and sport testing. In addition to last week's lab, I thought I would give you an additional resource you could look into if you were interested. By no way is this mandatory, but if you get a chance, I would highly recommend looking at the book Becoming a Supple Leopard by Dr. Kelly Starrett. Kelly Starrett's a physiotherapist, and he's worked with many high-performing athletes, including Olympic athletes and team sport athletes. He has a website or a YouTube channel called The Ready State, and his book includes tons of resources for mobility and activation exercise. I would highly recommend checking it out. Now, moving on with the lecture. So today we're going to discuss client pre-screening. Now this is everything you should do with your client before you start working or training with them specifically. We're going to discuss why this is important. We're going to talk about what you should include. We're going to talk about the initial assessment, and we're going to talk about goal setting and some ways we can kind of look at goals to hopefully make them more achievable for our clients. In addition, when we're working with athletes, we're going to perform a needs analysis on the sport that athlete is playing. So we're going to talk about how this differs from our general population clients, and we're going to look at the sport specifically. So in the coming slides, we'll talk about what to include in our pre-screen process. But why would we pre-screen our clients? So this is important because it covers us as a trainer or a coach when we're working with clients or athletes. This includes individually or as a group. With the information we gather from this, we would know what to do in case of emergency. We'll have contact information, we'll have previous medical history. And in addition, it creates trust between you and the client. It shows the client that you've done your due diligence in taking the proper steps to ensure that the client is safe while they're training with you. This is really important. For me, safety is always number one. So in the previous slide, I said safety is always number one. Now, I'm kind of half joking with this image here. These clips are what keep weight plates on a barbell. Now, if there are any athletes that have worked with me before, they know that safety never takes a holiday. It's always a top priority when we're working with any individual or athlete. If an athlete comes to Queens to play their sport and they get injured in the weight room, that's one of the worst things that can happen. It means they aren't available for their team, they can't play their sport, and then they have to go through the rehab process. So we always want to make sure that wherever we're training, the equipment is safe, the environment is safe, and we're always good and always making progress. So we'll see in this video here the reason why I like to have clips on the bar. So this athlete's here is at a CrossFit gym. In general, these gyms can be pretty busy. Right now, due to COVID, they're obviously empty. But we can see this athlete gets set up. He's got a lot of weight on the bar, and there's no clips holding those weights on. So he's going to go through his squat, and we see the plates just slide off the bar. Now, this is just one example of safety going wrong. Now, imagine if there was an individual working on this other bar here or working on these rings and these plates had fallen on them. Or if the gym is really busy and there's people walking around the rack. I'm sure if you've trained at the Arc before, obviously pre-COVID, in the afternoons, 4, 5, 6 o'clock, it can get really busy and there's a lot of people. So we always, when we're working with clients or athletes, we always want to make sure that everything is safe. Now, if you end up going into personal training, strength and conditioning, or even a rehab setting, you'll end up working with a variety of individuals from all walks of life. You might end up working with high-performance athletes, recreational gym goers, tactical population, an elderly population, or just individuals looking to lose some weight and stay healthy and active. One thing that all of these people have in common, for us as trainers or coaches, is that we want to make a great first impression and start building positive relationships with our clients and athletes. Like I said in the last slide, Making a great first impression is important because it begins that positive relationship with that individual athlete or group. Remember, you only have one chance to make a first impression. To give you an example, my first day working as a strength and conditioning coach at Queen's, there was an intern trying to coach a group of athletes leaning up against a wall with their hood up on their sweater. Now that doesn't leave a very good first impression for me working with that intern moving on. Thankfully, the individual was okay and we got along just fine. But when we're trying to work as a trainer or get clients as a personal trainer or coach, we need to make a really good first impression to try and build trust with that individual and then potentially have them purchase sessions or coaching or training off of us. All right, so one more slide here before we dive into the pre-screening process. So working as a trainer or a coach, you're trying to build buy-in or trust with those individuals. You're trying to sell the individual something they cannot tangibly see or hold. You're trying to sell them something they're going to see 6, 8, 12 weeks, a year down the road. So why should they hire you? You need to have a good first impression. You need to start building trust with them, creating positive relationships so that they eventually purchase and stay with you as a client. In varsity athletics, as coaches, myself and Colin, we're already hired. We're in place. We're the strength coaches for Queens. So the athletes that come to us, we don't have to sell them individual sessions, but we are trying to sell them a vision or process that they get to work towards as an athlete or individual. If you're interested in building buy-in or trust or the art of communication, Brett Bartholomew, the book here on the slide, Conscious Coaching, is a great book you can dive into to learn more about that. Okay, so pre-screening with individuals before we start working with them. We're going to go over some forms that we would use with them to kind of gather information to make a better informed decision about how we would go about providing training. So we're going to talk about a PAR-Q Plus form. We're going to talk about informed consent. We're going to go over some different types of questionnaires we can use. We can talk about health questionnaires, personal interest questionnaires, just trying to get to know the individual a little bit more. Like I said before, we're going to discuss goal setting, and we're going to go over needs analysis. So a PAR-Q Plus form is a physical activity and readiness questionnaire. It's used as a tool to pre-screen individuals and determine if it's necessary to acquire physician clearance before partaking in exercise. Like I said before, we want to cover ourselves as trainers or coaches, and we want to ensure the individual that we're working with is safe. This is a great tool to use, and we'll discuss it further in the coming slides. So this is the Physical Activity Readiness Questionnaire for everyone, PAR-Q Plus. This questionnaire will tell you whether it's necessary for you to seek further advice from your doctor or a qualified exercise professional before becoming more physically active. The form has 7 questions the individual must answer no to be cleared for physical activity. If they answer yes to one or more of the questions, there are follow-up questions later in the form. I'll be uploading this to OnQ for you guys to look at a little more in-depth and in its entirety. Let's take a look at the questions. Question 1. Has your doctor ever said that you have a heart condition or high blood pressure? Question 2. Do you feel pain in your chest at rest, during your daily activities of living, or when you do physical activity? Question 3. Do you lose balance because of dizziness, or have you lost consciousness in the last 12 months? Please answer no if your dizziness was associated with overbreathing, including during vigorous exercise. Question 4. Have you ever been diagnosed with another chronic medical condition other than heart disease or high blood pressure? Question 5. Are you currently taking prescribed medications for a chronic medical condition? Question 6. Do you have a bone or joint problem that could be made worse by becoming more physically active? Please answer no if you had a joint problem in the past, but it does not limit your current ability to be physically active. For example, knee, ankle, shoulder, or other. And question 7, has your doctor ever said you should only do medically supervised physical activity? In the following slide, we'll talk about some of the follow-up questions. So if the client answers no to the 7 questions we talked about previously, they're cleared for physical activity. They can move on to section 3 of the form and sign it. If they answered yes to one or more of the questions above, they'll need to move on to section 2. So I won't go through all of the follow-up questions, but this is an example of question 1 for the follow-up question. Do you have arthritis, osteoporosis, or back problems? So here you would answer yes if you did, then you would go through these follow-up questions. If not, you would answer no and then move on to question 2. I'll be posting the form to OnQ for you to look at in its entirety. I would highly recommend going through the form and reading all of the questions. So if the individual answered no to all of the follow-up questions, they're ready to participate and become more physically active. If they answered yes to one or more of the follow-up questions, they should seek further information with a licensed healthcare professional before training with you. Finally, they would sign, date the form, and then they would have a witness. If the individual is underage, they would have a signature of a parent or guardian. So there are other forms that you can get if you need to refer an individual to a physician. This way, you don't just tell the client, hey, go see your doctor and come back to me when you're good. You can give them a form like this one here, which says they've answered yes to one or more of the questions on the physical activity readiness questionnaire, which you can attach that form, and then the doctor knows what they need to look at specifically. And finally, there's a version of the Part Q you can use for individuals who are pregnant. So you could go through this sheet with the individual, and the same thing as the Part Q, you would make sure that they're safe to partake in an activity with you. All right, moving on with the pre-screening process. Next, we'll be talking about informed consent. An informed consent form is utilized to discuss the following with the client or individual. We'll talk about risks and benefits of exercise. We'll discuss confidentiality, and we need to make sure that there's acknowledgement of the terms within the form. So this is an example of a form you can look through. You can find these online. There's plenty of different ones. And in addition, it's suggested that the information within the informed consent form be delivered both in writing and verbally. So you can utilize these for training, or if you're taking someone through a fitness assessment on its own. For example, the informed consent form on the slide here is an example of one you could use when you're taking someone through a physical assessment. So it begins by saying, I, the undersigned, do hereby acknowledge my consent to undergo an assessment of my physical activity, sedentary behavior, lifestyle, and fitness. It then goes on to talk about answering questions concerning physical activity, sedentary behavior, and other lifestyle factors such as smoking and nutrition, measures of heart rate, blood pressure, height, weight, and waist circumference, submaximal aerobic fitness test that involves either stepping, walking, or cycling for a defined period of time to measure your heart rate response, and a series of musculoskeletal fitness tests that may include grip strength, push-ups, sit and reach, vertical jump, back extension, and one-leg stance. So this form basically outlines exactly what's going to go on so the individual has a clear understanding of what they're partaking in. Next, we have scope of practice and your governing body. So scope of practice is just what you're allowed to do with the client based on your certifications or credentials. So depending on which governing body you're associated with, this could be the Canadian Society of Exercise Physiology, the National Strength Conditioning Association, or any other sort of personal training certificates you have. There may be other information you'll be required to gather. For example, if you're a CPT through CSEP, you must refer to a physician if the client has a resting heart rate above 99 beats per minute and blood pressure above 144/94. So this is something you would do during the pre-screening process. You would check their resting heart rate and blood pressure. Next, we'll be moving on to questionnaires. But before we do that, I have a little activity for you. So I want you to pause the video and take a few minutes to make a list of all the information you feel would be important to know from your client. All right, I hope you all took a chance to do the activity. That's something we would have done in class if we were actually in a lecture hall. We would have split up into a couple groups, talked about some things we would have on questionnaires, and then we'd get back together and share our information. So most people usually forget some critical things when we talk about questionnaires, so we'll go through them here. So we use them to gather valuable information about the client. This includes risk factors related to health and lifestyle, in addition to that Part Q form that we did. We can also talk about previous injuries. So this can be any sort of injury or surgery they had. A lot of times people forget that they had injuries in their life. For example, I went to a physio a couple months ago, and they asked if I had any injuries or anything they should know about. And I just said no. I just completely forgot that a couple of years ago I had knee surgery. So if it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone. We can talk about previous training history. This is important if you're going to be training them, obviously. You can talk about what things they've done in the past, what things they liked, what things they didn't like. And another big thing we can talk about here is emergency contact information. So if you're training one-on-one with a client, we always want to have some person we can contact in case of an emergency. We can also use questionnaires to learn more about your client. So you can ask them about personal interests, favorite exercises or activities. So this is one thing I like to do with the athletes. When I have rookies come in, obviously we know they're there because they like playing their sport. So for example, there was an individual I asked, I said, hey, if you weren't playing your sport, what would you be doing? What sort of hobbies do you have? And I found out that he's in a band, loved making music. So I asked him and talked to him about his music, ended up listening to some of his tracks, and they were great. So that let me build a little bit better of a relationship with that individual, and I have a touch point I can come back to in subsequent sessions. So this is an example of a health medical questionnaire that you could use with your clients. This is from the NSCA. I believe it's from 2012, so it might be a little dated here. But it has some basic information about the client, name, date of birth, address, phone number, work number, email. In a case of emergency, who may we contact? Like I said, this is super important in case anything happens. And they go through past and present medical history. So they have some things here they ask. This is kind of covered in that PARQ Plus form. They also talk about the family history, which is good because some things are genetic here. So anything regarding heart attack or heart operations, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes. And then they get into activity history. So this is good for you to know as a trainer, obviously, if you're working with the individual, what they've done in the past, what they do now, what they do for their job. Do they work at a desk all day? Do they do manual labor? Obviously, that will affect your programming. So they have some questions here of like, where do you work? Have you ever worked with a personal trainer before? The date of your last physical performed by a physician? Did you participate in regular exercise at this time? And then they have you list what it was. And then just some other questions here. Any medications you're presently taking, and list and order your personal health and fitness objectives. Now, obviously, this is just a general form created online that many people can use. And when you create your own form, you can kind of tailor it to the situation that you're dealing with. So we can also use questionnaires in the form of monitoring. So it doesn't have to be just a one-time thing at the start of our session before we start working together. And we can use questionnaires day to day or week to week to kind of see how our client's doing and to see if we need to change anything up. So this question here is something you might give the individual every time you see them. Say you work with them twice a week. And then this is specifically here for athlete stress and recovery, but you could tailor it to just a regular Gen Pop client. So you would have the name, the date. They have questions regarding sleep duration. So here 1 being less than 4 hours, 5 being 8 or more hours. Sleep quality, talking about soreness, energy, mood. So these are all important things when we're talking about stress and recovery. So an athlete might sleep for a long time, but it might be really restless sleep. So we can then pair that with that sleep quality question to see how well they slept. So if they got 8 hours or more and they slept excellent, that's great. For muscle soreness here, we need to see how our sessions previously affect the sessions upcoming, and whether or not they're sore from something else. Maybe they had a hard practice or a game, or if we're working with a personal training client, maybe they had a really hard day at work, or they did something out of the ordinary. How much energy they have and mood is obviously important for mental health, and how they feel as far as like stressed out or no stress. Are they mentally focused? And then we get into some questions about nutrition. So the nutritional amount, so are they satisfied with how much they ate, or do they always feel hungry? And the nutritional quality. So do they feel they had a high quality food in their diet, or do they feel like they ate pretty poorly? And then finally, are they thirsty or do they feel well hydrated? So here they can make some general comments, and we can talk about any sort of pain on the diagram here. They can circle, hey, I have shoulder pain, or I have knee pain, or my upper back's hurting, or my ankle's hurting. So this just gives us more information that we can use to better drive decision making within our programming. So for instance, if I have a set program, we're on a 4-week training block and it's pretty intense. The individual has generally said they feel pretty good and they have a lot of time. Then they come in and I do this questionnaire with them and I see that their sleep duration was a 1, their sleep quality was a 2. They're feeling pretty sore because they went on a hike with their friend the other day and it was a 5-hour hike in the woods. Their energy's low and they feel like they haven't eaten very well. Well, I might scrap what we had for that day and we might go through more of a recovery-focused workout. So when we're using questionnaires, it doesn't have to be just a one-time thing. We can use them more frequently to help guide our programming. One thing to also note when using questionnaires for monitoring is that you need to continually provide feedback and educate the individual you're using these with as to why this is important. What often happens is if you just give these questions out, say for instance you're working with the team and you just have them fill this out every single time they're in here, but they never know why or see any differences in their programming based off of this, it's hard to kind of build buy-in and keep them doing this properly. What usually happens is we just get some either all excellence or everyone's just kind of in the middle, and those numbers just kind of get pretty normalized here. So when you're using this, it's always good to say, hey, look at your questionnaire today. You did this on sleep quality and your sleep duration is not great. Hey, what's up? Is anything going on? We can adjust your program this, and this way. How does that sound? So it's always good to just kind of keep communication open with the client based on any sort of monitoring information that you're using. All right. So finally, you can use questionnaires to figure out your client's personal interests and hobbies. Now, this is important in the early stages of that client coach relationship or client trainer relationship, because you want to kind of have things to kind of talk about with your client while you're training them. You're not just going to stand there like a robot, timing on the stopwatch, counting their sets and reps. You got to kind of be personal with them and start building that relationship. So, for an example, you can say, hey, I saw on your questionnaire you like music, you like this genre of music. Who's your favorite artist, or what's your favorite song? Or it says you like cooking. What's your favorite meal? And then you can go look into that, and then you have these touch points that you can use with your client. For instance, one individual I was working with, they told me about this telescope they bought. They bought this really big, high-powered telescope that they could use, and they were telling me how great it was and how they liked looking at certain things in space. So I was at the bookstore the other day, and then for Christmas, I got them like a visual guide to the galaxy, and they loved it. It was great. So you can really use this to kind of further build that relationship with that client. So how would pre-screening apply to other establishments that you're working at? Say, for instance, you become a personal trainer and you get a job at a private studio, a commercial gym, or you're a strength coach and you're working with a professional team or at a college or university setting. Most of these establishments will have their own protocol for pre-screening that you would need to go through. If you think something's missing, and say, for instance, you're working at a commercial gym and you would like to add in a questionnaire with one of your clients, obviously ask the gym, see if that's okay, and then you're probably good to go. Still make sure you're covering your bases, and obviously safety is number one with the client. So make sure you have all of that kind of sorted out, emergency contact information, anything you need that's relevant to their safety. And finally, your governing body, so the governing body you're certified with, will often have versions of all of these forms you can use. So for instance, the NSCA has a personal training contract agreement you could use, client assessment forms, load charts you can use when programming, health and medical questionnaires, assumption of risk and release of liability. So they have tons of resources you can use to kind of build your pre-screening package or pre-screening protocols. All right. So you finish pre-screening with your client. They filled out all the forms. They're good to go. They can participate in physical activity. So what do you do next? Well, you're going to take them through an initial assessment. Now, in the coming weeks, I'm going to talk about the FMS and I'll talk about testing. So we're not going to touch on that today. But what I would recommend with personal training clients is doing height, weight, some sort of body fat percent measure, and measuring their waist circumference. In a strength conditioning setting, you can do height, weight, body fat, but we're also going to talk about what a needs analysis is and how we can utilize that to improve our programming. So obviously, if you're working with a client, you're going to tell them why you would be doing all this, and then asking for their permission, making sure that's okay. So I'm going to go through these protocols. This is super important because even year to year with us, with testing our athletes, sometimes we're in different locations, measuring their height against the wall in different areas that might have a baseboard or like a little lip around the wall. So I just want to make sure that it's always consistent. So you're going to use an anthropometer attached to a scale, or you can use a tape against a wall. We just use a tape measure against the wall. And we always want to make sure that we're measuring in the same units. So we always want to use either feet or inches or centimeters, however you want to do that. But you're going to instruct your client to remove any footwear. You'll instruct your client to stand as tall as possible. Before taking the measurement, instruct your client to take a deep breath in. And you want to take the measurement to the nearest half inch or quarter inch or whatever you determine is important here. Now, if you have them remove their footwear, that's fine. This will make it more consistent. If you have them leave their footwear on, that's perfectly fine too. Just make sure you take note of that on your testing sheet. So if you're testing a team, make sure you take note of that. If you're testing just a regular individual, make sure you always remember, did we have footwear on or did we not? So sometimes we would want footwear on if we're testing our height and then also our reach. Say, for instance, a basketball player, we want to see how high can they actually touch. And it gives it a little more relevant to a game situation or how they would be on the court. Because sometimes a shoe can add an inch, inch and a half. So super important that every time we do any sort of testing or assessments, we're always very consistent in the protocol we choose, in the measures we use, and that we're making sure we check all of our equipment. So I also teach over at St. Lawrence College here in Kingston, and I was a strength coach there a few years back. So I had to test the rugby team there, and they had this really old tape measure. So I took it out to the field along with the other equipment I needed, and I started to begin measuring out things for broad jump and height and stuff like that. And the tape measure, something just didn't seem right. So I took a look at the tape measure, and it turns out that every foot was only 10 inches long on the tape measure. So it was a good thing that I looked at that tape measure. I don't know how old it was. It looked really old. But for some reason, it was 10 inches equaled 1 foot on that tape measure, which is obviously incorrect. So if I had gone through testing using that tape measure without checking it first, I would have been in big trouble because all of my numbers would have been wrong. So it's really important that our protocols are always consistent and we try as best as possible to use the same equipment every single time. All right, moving on with the initial assessment, measuring weight. Now this, for personal training, might be the most important to individual clients. They always want to know how much they weigh or they want to lose weight. So having a consistent scale or a consistent way to measure your weight is important. You can use any sort of calibrated scale. It doesn't have to be a crazy expensive one. You can buy one off Amazon. They're relatively cheap. As long as you measure yourself at the same time every day. So it's always super consistent that if you're weighing yourself every day, you do it at the same time. If you weigh yourself once a week, you do it at the same time, say Monday in the morning when you wake up. So you would instruct your client to remove any unnecessary clothing. You're going to instruct your client to gently step on the scale and remain as still as possible and record the measurement to the nearest quarter pound. Now, if you have a digital scale, you can just take the digital reading. Now, what I would do, if I'm working with a client and we're measuring weight, I would have them weigh themselves. Obviously, if I can't be there every single day, I would have them weigh themselves every morning, and then we would average out the week. So they would weigh themselves 7 days. They would take an average of that for the week, and then as we continue to move on week to week to week, we can see if there are fluctuations week to week. Day to day, there obviously can be fluctuations depending on how much you eat, how much water you drink, how much sodium you've taken in, things like that. So that's why I like to kind of average out the week and see from there if we're actually making progress towards any sort of goals we made, whether it's to gain weight, gain lean muscle mass, or to lose weight. All right, so moving on, measuring body fat. So we want to see, did this individual put on weight, or if they lost weight, did they lose body fat or did they lose lean tissue? So obviously we want to maintain lean tissue. So various ways you can measure body fat percentage. We have a calibrated scale with bioelectrical impedance, skin fold calipers, hydrostatic weighing, DEXA scans, and bod pods. Now, hydrostatic weighing, DEXA scans, and bod pods are pretty expensive. I've never actually used them personally or had the chance to use them. I have used skin fold calipers and I have used calibrated scales. The most common one is bioelectrical impedance. Those are on most scales, most digital scales now. And the big thing about them that's really important to let your client know is that they might not be accurate, but they're consistent. So the bioelectrical impedance, it sends a current through the body, and then it can tell you what your body fat percentage is. So for instance, if you step on the scale and it says you're this however many pounds of body fat and this percentage, say it's 20% body fat, it might be 18, it might be 22, anywhere in there. So it might not be super accurate, but if you were to lose 1% body fat, that would reflect within the scale. So bioelectrical impedance is relatively consistent, but it might not be super accurate. So, and then we would measure waist circumference. So this is important for health-related issues. So we're going to just use an anthropometric measuring tape. And we want to align the tape measure parallel with the floor around the abdomen just above the iliac crest. So we want to make sure the tape is snug and it doesn't compress the abdominal tissue. And then we would record the measurement to the nearest inch. So if we're working on any sort of body composition related goals, this would be important to know. If clients are kind of shy about things like this is something that I might leave off the table and just try and do height and weight. So here are just some excerpts from some research articles referencing waist to height ratio as a cardiometabolic risk factor, or how we can detect cardiometabolic risk factors. So here, this is a BMI versus waist to height ratio, which we can get obviously from measuring height and our waist circumference. So for the first time, robust statistical evidence from studies involving more than 300,000 adults in several ethnic groups shows the superiority of waist to height ratio over waist circumference and BMI for detecting cardiometabolic risk factors in both sexes. Waist to height ratio should therefore be considered as a screening tool. And waist to height ratio may be a more useful global clinical screening tool than waist circumference, with a weighted mean boundary value of 0.5, supporting the simple public health message, keep your waist circumference to less than half of your height. So what do we do for initial assessments at Queen's? So before we do any sort of screening or testing with our athletes, they have to do the following. So our recruits coming in, they have to fill out a waiver, an activity waiver, and then they're allowed to access online training with us through the app that we use to program called Team Builder. And then before they can train with us in person, they have to do a medical clearance with a doctor, and they have to do an electrocardiogram or an ECG. And that has to be completed and approved by our sports medicine department before they can train or practice with us in person. So obviously the medical history or questionnaire is important, and the ECG is really important, because what the ECG does is it measures the activity of the heart, and it can pick up any sort of heart issues before things happen. So it's kind of an extra layer of safety for us when we're working with our athletes. So after this initial assessment, any further tests or screens will be decided based on your client's needs and goals. So these tests will be related to the following. So any sort of movement capacity, cardiovascular endurance, muscular strength, muscular endurance, flexibility, speed, power, anything like that. And we'll be covering those tests over the next couple weeks in lectures and labs. All right, now we'll move on to goal setting. So it's important to understand your client's goals for obvious reasons. They're paying you to provide them a service. So we need to make sure that their program is tailored around achieving their goals. So for instance, if my client wants to run a marathon, I might want to include something that will help them run that marathon, not just going into the gym, squatting a 1 rep max every day. The program should be tailored around their goals. We need to figure out what their goals are. We need to then help them kind of tailor those goals and make them a little more specific, which we'll talk about in a bit. And we need to help them achieve those goals. And if we're working with a team, our goals might not be tailored to each individual person on the team. So for instance, Colin and I work with a lot of athletes. It would be almost impossible for us to ask each individual athlete what their personal goals are. So our goals are more performance-based, and we create these with the coach, and we call these key performance indicators, or KPIs. So what sort of goals or what sort of KPIs drive our programming with our teams? So now I'm going to talk about some ways we can kind of look at goals and kind of refine them down to help make them more specific for our clients. So we have something called a long-term goal. So this provides a meaningful pursuit to the client. So it's something further down the line, like could be a couple months, could be a year. And it's often what they tell you when you ask them about their goals the first time. So when you meet them for the first time and you go through your pre-screening and your assessments and your questionnaires, and you say, hey, what are your goals? What are your fitness goals? It's usually some long-term goal. Like, I want to run a marathon, or I want to lose 50 pounds, or there might even be more general than that. So our goal here is to kind of peel away at what their goals are and make them a little more specific. So with that long-term goal, we also have short-term goals. So if their long-term goal is to run a marathon, obviously we'll make that a little more specific, and I'll talk about how we do that later on. But we have short-term goals that kind of build to that long-term goal. And in general, the short-term goals are often created with the trainer and coach, or the trainer and the client together. Because the client usually comes in, they have some sort of long-term goal, and then it's the trainer's job to kind of build these short-term goals or work with the client to create these short-term goals to then achieve that long-term goal. So I classify these as like stepping stones to keep progressing in the right direction. They can be broken down multiple times, either in the week, the day, just smaller goals that we're going to use. So this allows the individual to understand what's needed to reach their long-term goal. So for instance, if their long-term goal was that I would like to run a marathon, so maybe a short-term goal was today we're going to run 1K. We'll run 1 kilometer, and then we'll build on that progressively over the coming weeks and months. So with the short and long-term goals, we also have outcome and process goals. So with outcome goals, the goal is clearly defined. That doesn't necessarily mean it's specific or it's a good goal. It's just clearly defined. In sport, this is often associated with winning. So a team might make an outcome goal of, we want to win the championship. Or an individual athlete might make an outcome goal of, I want to win this race or come first in this event. So these can be highly motivating to the individual or team. So in a team setting, obviously winning the championship is motivating as a collective. So also in general, these are usually out of your direct control. So they have no control over who wins a championship. It might be them. They might play as well as they can. They might do everything right and still lose. So with outcome goals, we add in process goals to try to achieve those outcome goals. Now, process goals, the individual or team has a high degree of control over. So they're used in achieving those outcome goals. So, for example, if an outcome goal of a client is to lose 50 pounds, which is obviously a big goal, we need to make some process goals to kind of aid in achieving that outcome goal. So, for instance, a process goal might be, tomorrow I'll wake up at 6 a.m. so I can make my lunch for work and have time to walk for 30 minutes. So it's something that they have direct control over. They can set the alarm clock, they can get up, they can make their lunch, and they can go for a walk, whether it's outside or on a treadmill, whatever you have. So these process goals are kind of like short-term goals, but they're under your direct control, and they aid in achieving that outcome goal. So whether you use short-term or long-term goals or process goals and outcome goals, we have to make our goals SMART. And I'm sure you've all heard this before, but SMART goals, it's an acronym. SMART stands for specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound or timely. So we want to make our clients' goals SMART to ensure the highest rate of success. So in this process, it also lets us break down the goal to better understand why the client wants to achieve this. So a general goal a client might give you is, I want to lose weight, or I want to get fit so that I can play with my kids. Okay? So we're going to break those goals down to make them a little more specific, and then it helps us kind of understand where the client's coming from. So we might ask them why they want to lose weight, and they might say, oh, I have a trip coming up, or I'm getting married, or whatever it is. Then we're going to make it very specific. So how much weight do they want to lose? So for instance, our goal might be, instead of just to lose weight, we want to lose 15 pounds. So it's a specific goal, 15 pounds lost. Is it measurable? Okay, so can we measure that? Yes, we can measure 15 pounds. Is it attainable? Well, how much time do they have to lose the 15 pounds? If they have a year, completely attainable. So say they want to lose 15 pounds in 1 year. Is it realistic and attainable? Yes. And is it time bound? So do we have a time limit on this goal? So we've created, from this general, I want to lose weight, we've created a SMART goal. So from there, we would then go about utilizing process goals and short-term goals to kind of help them achieve this goal. And finally, we obviously want to make sure that our clients are as successful as possible. So we want to identify any barriers that might come in the way here. So for instance, for that last example of getting up at 6 a.m. and going for a walk and making their lunch, it might be something as they don't do well with mornings. So a barrier might be they're not good at getting up in the morning. So we might then say, hey, it might be better for us to go to bed a little bit earlier, or try and get less screen time later at night so they can sleep better, so that it's easier for them to get up. Okay, whatever the barriers might be, we just need to try and identify them as best as possible, and they'll come up along the way, and we'll have to deal with them kind of as you go. So as we kind of wrap up goal setting here, another little activity for you is create a general goal for yourself. Use the SMART process to refine that goal. Identify potential barriers for the goal, and then create process goals to help you achieve your outcome. So this is a good way to kind of go through the goal setting process to refine and specify your goal so that you have the highest chances of achieving it. Okay, moving on from goal setting. So now we're going to talk a little more specifically about working with athletes and figuring out how to do a needs analysis on the sport. So when we're working with athletes, our programming should aim to mitigate injury risk and increase performance. Now, when we're working with athletes and we need to do a needs analysis, we need to understand the sport to kind of understand how we need to program for it properly. So the best way to do this is to watch the sport. We can do research on it as well, but we need to watch the sport to kind of see how athletes move and what they need to do and accomplish. Even better, if you get a chance to play the sport, obviously not at the same level of the athletes you're working with, but recreationally, you can kind of understand what you need to do in the sport. You'll be able to feel the next day how sore you are in certain areas and what you need to kind of work on. So when we're doing a needs analysis and we're looking up research on the sport, this is called like a time motion analysis, which I'll talk about in a second. We want to utilize information as close to the team and demographic we're working with. So if I'm working with high school aged athletes, I don't really want to use information or research articles from the highest performers in the world, say in professional leagues. I want to see if there's information on, say, college athletes or specifically, if possible, other high school athletes. For us at Queens, we can use data from the States, from the NCAA, and then if we need to, we can use data from professional leagues. So for instance, for our rugby teams, the kind of next level up is professional leagues for them, so we can sometimes use information from international play. And like I said before, we'll be discussing testing in upcoming lectures, so anything to do with testing for athletes, we'll talk about later. Right now, we're just talking about figuring out the needs analysis for the sport. So if we look at elite basketball here, we can see the breakdown of like movement within the game. So here we have standing, or the activity. Let's start with the activity first. We then have the speed of movement in kilometers per hour, the total distance covered, and the percentage of time spent within the activity. Now we have standing. Obviously, that would be a speed of movement of 0. Total distance covered would be 0. But the percentage of time spent in the activity is 32%. We then move on to walking, jogging, running, sprinting, striding, low-intensity shuffle, moderate-intensity shuffling, high-intensity shuffling, sideways running, and jumping. So we can see the breakdown here of the speeds the individuals reach during these movements. So in sprinting, they're at greater than 24 kilometers per hour. And then at high-intensity shuffling, they're at greater than 9.1 kilometers per hour. So we can see that they reach some pretty high speeds of movement during the game. And then we can also see the total distance covered. So we can see here, jogging seems to be the highest distance covered within the game. Now, when we look at this data, we have to understand the sport and not just the numbers. Okay? So if I just looked at the numbers, I would say, hey, this individual spends the most time jogging and they spend the most time standing around. So I don't really need to prepare them for very much, but that's not quite the case. So we know that sprinting, even though it's a lower number than the rest of the distance covered, and percentage of time is only 2.8%, this is the highest kind of activity or intensity activity they'll be doing. So we need to make sure that their body and tissues are prepared for this. Same with, for instance, the high intensity shuffling. And we can also see that the jumping, speed of movement is 0, total distance covered is 0, percentage of time spent in the activity is 1.7. So if you don't really understand what's biomechanically what's going on here, you don't really realize that jumping is a big part of basketball, and you should probably prepare your athletes to be able to jump and jump high. So moving on from here, in this article, Conditioning for Basketball, Quality and Quantity of Training, we can see in these studies that basketball players run between 4.5 kilometers and 7.5 kilometers per game and perform up to 1,000 different actions within the game. Then we can also see that medium to high intensity actions have a 1-to-1 density with 15 seconds of duration approximately. So 15 seconds work and 15 seconds recovery. Where high to maximal intensity actions last 2 to 5 seconds, 2 seconds predominantly, and have a 1-to-10 density. So 2 seconds of work and 20 seconds of recovery. So this information paired with KPIs or key performance indicators from the coach and our understanding of the team and athletes we have available to us can then drive our programming. So we know that we have to prepare our individual athletes and teams playing basketball to be able to withstand and handle this high intensity action. And then if we go back to the previous slide, we obviously know that sprinting, jumping, high intensity shuffling, these are the most high intense activities they'll be doing in the game. So we need to make sure that our athletes are prepared for this. So we can look at a needs analysis for international female rugby union players. We would use data like this to compare with our female team at Queen's because there's very little data done on women's rugby in Canada. So just like the basketball example, we can see that standing, walking, and jogging take up a massive amount of the game. So in an 80-minute match, there's 21 minutes of standing, on average 36 minutes of walking, and just 10 minutes of jogging. Now, similar to the example in basketball, we wouldn't spend the majority of our programming working on standing, walking, and jogging. We kind of have to dive a little deeper and understand more of the high intensity mechanics of the game, along with the data to inform our decisions and hopefully increase performance of our teams. So we can see here that sprinting would be the highest speed activity, which averages about 1 minute and 42 seconds for the forwards and 2 minutes and 36 seconds for the backs. So with this being the highest intensity activity, we need to make sure that our athletes are capable of completing this and performing this within the game. In addition, we have more of the sport-specific activities, so lifting, rucking, mauling, tackling, scrums. Obviously, this is a little bit more for the forwards. But we need to make sure that these individuals are prepared through strength and conditioning and their practice to kind of handle the loads and forces that they would kind of get within the game. So finally, for our needs analysis, we need to understand what specific movements we should be training to kind of build resiliency within the body and ideally improve performance. So for example, if we look at a volleyball player, they need to dive on the ground, they need to move in all planes of motion, they need to jump, they need to hit, they need to swing at the ball, they need to pass. So for our programming, we should probably include some sort of lunging, whether that be forward lunges, Cossack squats, or lateral lunges to the side, working in all ranges of motion. We should be working on shoulder stability and strength to kind of work that overhead position when they're blocking or hitting. We obviously need to work on speed within the first 1 or 2 steps. And we need to work on explosive lower body power for jumping and reactivity. So something like this, you can look through the literature, but it doesn't have to be super complicated. We can watch the game, we can look at the time motion analysis, and we can kind of break down, obviously with the help of the coach, what sort of movements we should be training. A lot of the times, if we build off that example of a volleyball player, trainers get caught in this trap of just trying to focus on strength. So they'll only do like bilateral, which is like 2-leg squats. So like barbell back squats, front squats, deadlifts. And they overlook the benefit of having that movement through all planes of motion. All right, to kind of sort of wrap up here, we want to keep it simple. Complete your pre-screening process, go through the necessary forms, do your initial assessment. If you're working with athletes, understand the game they're playing. But at the same time, both athletes and if you're working with Gen Pop clients, they want their sessions to be engaging and they want to have some fun. A varsity athlete doesn't want to go to class for 6 to 8 hours a day and then come to a workout session where they just hate what they're doing and they don't like it. And same goes for a personal training client. A client definitely does not want to wake up early before work and come to a session where they're not enjoying it, and they're not having fun, where they're always doing exercises they hate. So the best thing is just try and find a way to build a relationship with those athletes or that individual and make that session fun and engaging. So in summary, pre-screening is an important first step when working with a client. Ensuring you have all the appropriate forms filled out covers you as a trainer or coach, and it ensures that the client you're working with is safe. Working with your clients to help refine and make their goals more specific will better ensure their success. You want to take the goal the client has, refine it, break it down to those short-term and process goals, and really work at helping them achieve their goal. And finally, utilizing data and understanding the movements of the sport will help create reliable needs analysis to drive programming and ideally improve performance. Next lecture, we'll be going over the functional movement screen and breaking down all the movements within the screen. Thanks for tuning in. As always, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out and send me an email. I hope you guys have a great day, and I'll see you guys on Wednesday. Thanks.